Hi there, my name is Victoria Pham and I'm an Australian installation artist, composer, sound artist and sound researcher. Thank you again for coming back and joining me for this episode of Sounds Unheard, where I'll be unpacking some of my research practice and how that lends itself into imagining new ways of making music and in particular new ways of listening. So for today's episode, I'm actually going to run through more deeply different ways that we can use our ears to listen to the past, to listen to now, and also to potentially use those techniques to listen and make music for the future. In the previous episode where I kind of gave you a rundown of my background as a musician and a researcher, I mentioned briefly that perhaps this time I'm going to go through more deeply into what I labelled in the previous episode as listening backwards and listening forwards. So, as a pretext to that, if you remember what happened in the previous episode, and if you haven't gone to the end yet, I invite you to have a little peek now. We sat together and did one of Pauline Oliveris's sonic meditations, and in particular that one was about attuning ourselves to the present and in fact using our body, and if you had an instrument, maybe an extension of your body, but for me I used my voice to kind of attune myself into different pitches that were occurring in the space. And I'm not sure if the microphone right now is picking up what's happening, and this is partly why I chose to film outside, but from this vantage point, and I'll stop talking in a second so you can hear what I'm referring to. I'm in a courtyard on upper floor of an apartment building. From here you can hear the traffic coming from the other side of this courtyard and beyond that other building, the one that's over there. You can hear some construction, you can hear a little bit of chatter, clanging of ceramic as other apartment block livers and inhabitants make their lunch. You can also, through all of it, hear a tiny, tiny bit of birdsong. So this is just a kind of way to connect you back to what happened in our previous episode together, but also to begin to attune our ears into what is going to happen today. So today, what I'm particularly interested in unpacking is the act of listening itself. For those of us who are able-bodied to listen fully and to listen with our ears, one or both, very often you will realize that silence isn't actually a thing. We talk a lot about silence as in like the gaps between noise, intentional or not, that exist around us, but if you listen closely, there's almost no silence at all. This comes into play in different ways, but I just wanted to touch on that because that is one key feature that's going to help us with listening more deeply, forwards and backwards. I'm going to start with listening backwards first. That seems like a good place to start. And the reason why listening backwards is, I think, even though it sounds really odd, is a little bit more familiar to us, is if you've played a musical instrument, if you've had any training, or if you've seen someone play a musical instrument, more often than not, even if their physical instrument is contemporary, has been made recently, and they're playing it in the now, it's in many ways historical. So how we study music, often first we look at how that instrument has moved through history, through time, and often we're doing that by looking backwards. So for me, I was studying piano, and for anyone out there who also is studying piano or has studied piano or is about to, you do a lot of historical study. It's a way to train you to know the history, and through the history, the voice of the instrument, the type of music that has been written for the instrument and why it works well, and in some cases, why it hasn't. So very often, if you play piano, you have to play a lot of Hanon exercises, Czerny exercises. You do those 48 fugues by Bach. You know, that's music that's stretching back into the 18th century, maybe 17th century. So there's a lot of historical work that we come from already when we look about or think about making music and organizing sound into music. So surprisingly, even though it sounds, oh, you may have heard a child there. So surprisingly, even though it sounds like there's a weird thing, why I can't listen backwards, it's something that we're already trained to do. I'm going to say that again because a child just gurgled. So surprisingly, even though it sounds like a really weird thing, like listening backwards, I can't listen backwards, it's already something in many ways that we're already trained to do. So in some of my work, I wanted to expand on this idea beyond that, and that came through two different ways. I trained first, beyond the musical realms of my training, I studied to be an archaeologist. And in archaeology, you work with physical things, and archaeologists call that cultural material. Material being something that you can touch, something that you can see, something you can hold. Maybe one of the three, maybe all of the three. And the problem is, you can't really hold sound. Sound doesn't fossilize in the same way. Physical objects do, but, and in many ways I suppose you can sort of now through digital records, but archaeologically speaking, you can't really find a record of sound. So then that little kind of research question, and research is a big part of a lot of what I do. Research often leads you to sort of answers, but more often than not leads you to more questions. So this particular question of, well, if I can't find a record of sound, what can I do? And creatively speaking, that opens so many different ways of looking at sound, of making sound and imagining it, and kind of challenging the different ways that we consider sound and listen to it. So within archaeology, there's this weird form of study called archaeoacoustics, which is all about sound and all about ancient, prehistoric sound, and maybe asking questions if, like, how long ago did music start as a practice? Were there instruments? If there were, what did they sound like? Now, I'm gonna perhaps disappoint you and say that I don't know the answer to most of those questions, but as a musician and a sound artist, those kind of unknowns made different ways of making music possible. And I mentioned earlier that number one, research was a really helpful way of framing my questions, finding more questions, and seeing what other people were doing. And the other way was deep listening. So I've already said we're used to listening backwards, and then archaeoacoustics was like, how do we actually recreate sounds of the past? Well, I would say two ways of deep listening here. Kind of reflecting on what we did with that meditation. When you enter a space, in an archaeological manner, it could be a field site, it could be anywhere. Or, more likely, and actually some of my first encounters, is encountering an instrument inside a museum or an art gallery that's kind of hidden to you. Generally it's behind glass, or it's on some sort of plinth with a label, and you can't touch it. More importantly in this case, you can't hear it. So then, how can we from that position, if we can't touch something, and if technically it leaves no trace of sound, how can we imagine different ways of listening? So, I would say two things. Paying attention to your environment around it. Even if you cannot hear the music from the source of itself, you can imagine it. And even more importantly, and I'll show you how to do this a bit later, using microphones to record the space around you, the music that you could make, and thinking about how this all interweaves together. So this all sounds a bit weird, but I promise I'll run through an exercise at the end which joins all of these odd concepts together into one. So, I've kind of talked briefly about listening backwards, but what about listening forwards? So listening forwards is kind of a weird one, because it kind of combines the technique that I'm telling you about with the listening backwards. So we've done our research, hypothetically, about what this instrument could be, what music could be like from a certain period, what other sounds we could draw out of our already available to us historical instruments, like, what sound could a piano make now? What sound could this drum make now? We're already starting to extract different sounds, play with it, experiment, be imaginative. And in that process, in a way, we're already shaping our ears and our music making and our hands to listening to the future. So aside from archaeology, I'm also intrigued in environmental sounds. Like before today, you already had a little listen to the soundscape that's happening around me as I talk to you about these concepts. And another fun concept that we're going to dip into briefly for today, but in a bit more detail while I show you how to apply these techniques for music making and sound making. It's called bioacoustics. And bioacoustics is basically one word that's smashed together from two things: biology and acoustics. Bioacoustics. It basically is a field of research that combines many things. It's generally scientific. It involves theorems from biology, neuroscience, communication and signaling and engineering, as well as sound theory and acoustics, which stands on its own as a field of research. So again, research here plays a big role in how I work, but it brings into focus biological, ecological, environmental sounds. And for the most part, this research is about how animals can communicate, but for me, I kind of wanted to push a little bit further, and I wanted to know how plants and fungi could communicate. So much like how I was thinking about listening backwards, this involves listening to how these systems of sound making, these animals, these plants, these organisms are making sound now, listening to them deeply, kind of taking them in, making note of them, and where you can, recording them, and using those records from your research and listening practice as the foundations of the music you're going to write, of the sounds that you're going to design, or the art that you're going to make that is about sound. So, for today, we're just going to run through a really brief exercise of how this could work. So I've already introduced you to the sounds that's happening now. I'm going to do a better recording and I'm going to kind of smack it here. But before I do that, I want you to really listen closely. In fact, I'd recommend you to put headphones on, because that actually will give you perhaps a more of a immersive experience of what's going on here. This is a very basic city soundscape. For if you want to know where I am, this is actually in Paris, France. It's in February, so it's still kind of the tail end of winter, so a little bit cold. I don't know if those environmental factors will affect your listening, but maybe they will. Listen, especially here, to the kind of different textures you're getting and how they layer on top of each other and how they interplay. And then we're just going to use this as an exercise, and then once you kind of listen to it, maybe you need to listen to it a couple of times. I know I do. And then we're going to come back and we're going to draw out an image of what music could look like from this experience. See you soon. All right, so I think you've already had a couple of minutes to mull your ears in this kind of bizarre city landscape example that I've provided for you. What we're going to do now is take a transcription. And no, you don't need any like high-end musical software for this. You don't need like the ability to have perfect pitch to do this particular exercise. What I want you to focus on when we draw this transcription is not so much the notes, the specific rhythm. Of course you can, if that's something that is drawing you in. But actually, I want you to think about the layers, how they link, what I talked about earlier before we started the exercise, and kind of like the texture of the sound when you play it. And we're going to draw out a little soundscape together, and I will draw out one in front of you and go through what I've done. And I'd be so interested to see what you come up with as well.
Okay, so as we're listening to the soundscape together, and as we're listening to things around us, and you can even do this with pretty much anything, even if it's a fully fledged piece of music, it'd be an interesting exercise to do. Or as I do, just kind of sitting outside or listening to a recording I've taken earlier or something a friend has sent me. Okay, and for me, I like to call this sound painting. So I'm going to do this with you and draw along as you take the time to notate and paint out what you think is happening in this soundscape. So here is kind of a rough transcription of some things I heard. As you saw me doing it, you'll probably notice it's not necessarily chronological. I kind of bounce around and kind of remember something that may have happened before that is triggered in the recording, like this noticing about halfway through that this drone kind of keeps going and underlays it. And I found that quite interesting. And you can go back and listen to that again, which is why in this moment at the bottom I decide to focus in on it and bring your attention to the different kinds of like textures that you can hear. If you listen really closely, you kind of just catch voices, and then the kind of undulating movement that's coming from that drone sound, I think, is the wind, as well as just a little hint of traffic kind of moving around there, so represented by these large shapes. So this seems kind of like, what on earth? What am I going to do with this? And actually, I do this as an exercise quite a lot, not just to get my ears in tune with what's occurring around me, but as a basis for composition, which can either be electronic composition or sound design, or actually translating or transcribing the things that I've made a note of here onto a musical score. So for example here, let me see if I can show you this a little bit closer. You can see the little bird song notation I've used here, which is beep, 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 woo, if you were to transcribe that vocally, which sounds not like music. However, if we take that little cell here and we flip it around, so I'm just going to turn the page over. Okay. So we have bird song. Kind of 3 beeps or tweety noises and a kind of longer whistle sound. And if you go back, you kind of hear it quite clearly, kind of sitting above the rest of the sounds in the soundscape. If we wanted to translate this, say for a work for flute, or really any instrument, or like I did earlier with the example with voice, etc., we just simply turn it into a rhythm. Let's say da, 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 da. And there you go, you can use it. And if you're gonna, this is not an unfamiliar technique, so if you look at works by famous French composer Messiaen, for example, he actually went out and was very much an amateur ornithologist and would listen to lots of birdsong, make record of them, and kind of use them directly in his pieces. So now we've done one thing, we've taken rhythm from the thing that we've heard in the recording or our soundscape, like can we take pitch from it? So let's try here. I would say if you're going to do it directly, it would be super high. So we're going to do something like this. So beep, beep, beep. Maybe even with a staccato there. And then beep. Now, I'm going to make something very clear here. I don't actually have perfect pitch, but I hope that I sang an A. But this is just to illustrate the many things that you could do from just listening to things around you. So this is the acoustic possibilities. And you can do this with many things, with the drone, with anything you're hearing. I once wrote a piece where I took a rhythmic dictation of a conversation people were having on the train. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but they were very loud. But it did serve a very good musical process. So, how can you use this electronically? So, what I would actually do is like cut out the actual piece of sound and run it through a series of like different processes or different ways of manipulating sound. And I'm actually going to show you how I use these techniques in episode 4. So please come back for that, and we're going to work more with electronic design and field recordings. I hope this exercise has been useful and something that you can return to. It's the basis of a lot of works that I've written, and it's actually something that's been influenced by a lot of other composers who use similar techniques, and sometimes they refer to it as just drawing out sound, graphic notation, sound hierarchy, and some people I know, instead of using diagrams the way I have shown you, they simply write down a list of words. So I hope you have fun, and I hope this was useful, and I hope that your ears are ready for next time.
So although this doesn't seem like, it's not a complete piece of music, but for me, it's a really good place to start. And it's a good way to listen closely, pick out these sounds. Maybe sometimes you wouldn't even pay attention to them or think that you could turn the ordinary into music and kind of swirl them around, transpose or translate them onto your instrument of choice or your instruments of choice, or your voice. Or if you're into electronic music or sound design, just drawing out those exact recordings and using them as a foundation. So for today, this is just the exercise that I'm going to leave you with, just as a way to begin to pay attention to what is happening around you and how you may choose to turn that into music, how you might hear something that inspires a whole piece, but really just to listen carefully. And next week, if you are coming back to join me, we actually unpack that kind of cloudy conceptual idea of listening backwards more closely with a filmmaker and artist, James Nguyen, who is going to join me. And the two of us are going to talk about a project that we did that became all about writing music, commissioning music, and reimagining musical traditions with a single archaeological artifact, a 3,000-year-old drum called the Dongsen drum. So I hope you come back and join me for that. And if you're interested in further applying these kind of technical skills, what you can draw from a recording, or what you can extract from bioacoustic ways of researching and listening, in the final episode, I'm actually going to take you out in the field with me. You're going to come with me, and we're going to take some field recordings together and see the different ways, through acoustic instruments or through electronic software, how we can design a piece of music and play with sound. So thank you so much for taking the time and joining me here today, and see you next time.